Jack Welch once said that a union is only needed when the manager is a horse's ass. But what happens when the union is led by one? In the case of the Teamsters, home to over 1 million transport workers and led by the infamous Jimmy Hoffa until his disappearance in 1975, and now again by his son, James Jr., the injustice that many workers take issue with in management also seems to extend to the union leadership itself. Corruption takes many forms, but accounts of embezzlement, vote tampering, and member intimidation are rife amongst the Teamsters. With union membership down across the board in America over the past 60 years, management's relative power has increased, and the few workers who do try to get involved are under increasing pressure to remain quiet.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Military-industrial complex.
A new world order.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostages.
Ich bin ein Tier.
На полный разгром гнусных захватчиков.
Myth20c podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Myth of the 20th Century. Today we are joined by a very special guest from the Teamsters Union. His name is Mike. Please say hello.
Hello, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for coming on to give us an inside scoop on, I think it's the largest union in the United States, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, they are. Over 1 million members.
That's right. And I'm also joined by Hans.
Hi, guys.
And at some point, we're hoping to have Nick, but he's yelling at his computer, so just us for now. So, Mike, just to set the stage, I just wanted to kind of give a little bit of background, and this is my just layman's knowledge of the unions. Please correct me here, but my understanding of unions is that they kind of grew out of the tradition of the guilds, which were more individual craft-based guilds. So if you're a carpenter, if you're a blacksmith or something, we don't have those anymore, obviously. But those were kind of the origins of where these unions came from, and it was really the Industrial Revolution that spurred the formation of these larger groups of people in these large institutions like factories to come together, as opposed to before, where in a small town you might have a shoesmith, a blacksmith, somebody who's expert at something, and that was sufficient for the town. But what happened when the Industrial Revolution took off is you'd have this centralization of all the production in large places like factories that would then ship the products throughout the country, if not the world. And that created just this huge concentration of people, and it got much more complicated. And the sort of scientific way to kind of organize that in at least the kind of early 1900s, late 1800s was sort of the Taylor model, which was considered scientific management, which was basically very dehumanizing in a lot of ways. It was applying the rigors of stopwatches and things like that to the assembly line, and that became even more prevalent during the era of Ford, when he was doing automotive assembly with very specialized jobs along a production line where individuals would, whereas 50 years prior they might actually be responsible for making an entire horse carriage themselves. Now all they're doing is putting on a wheel, and they have to do that for 10 hours a day or whatever it was. Which is very sort of boring, obviously, and but it's more efficient. And so that was the sort of attraction of that system, is that people were offered more money, and they simply couldn't compete otherwise. So a lot of people had to kind of join that type of system. Now, as it pertains to the Teamsters, I was curious how that sort of fit into the kind of broader labor movement. There was like miners who would strike, railroad workers who would strike. Factory workers obviously would do that, but the Teamsters are transportation oriented. So maybe you can kind of give us a little bit of a sort of connection to how the Teamsters fit into the story of labor in the United States, at least.
The Teamsters are in a good position for being more of a powerful force, because when the Teamsters shut down, nothing else gets to move. We get when the transportation network shut down, there is no more commerce. So I think the Teamsters were started around 1905, and back then they were using horse-drawn carriages, before the automobile. And the Teamsters have been corrupt from the start. You try to look at the history of the labor movement and see exactly who the people were who started these unions, and it's very cloudy. The Teamsters Union is there's a little bit more information on the Teamsters Union. You get to kind of see who the players were that started that whole thing. But for the rest of the unions, their beginnings are really sort of shrouded in mystery as far as I can tell.
Well, it's kind of an interesting concept that you would have something as widely distributed as transportation form something as concentrated as a union, and actually being able to enforce that effectively is also another question. Because just imagine, like, especially during the origins of the Teamsters, if they're organizing people who run horses and carriages and move things in the back of the stagecoach or whatever it was called, how the hell do you coordinate that without the telegraph and the internet, obviously? And given how spread out everything was back then compared to now, with airplanes and stuff connecting people really quickly, it seems like it would be really easy just to, like, okay, look, this guy is not willing to run the goods to the next town. Well, I'll do it. I have a horse. It seems like it'd be very easy to break, So I'm curious how that ever became kind of like an effective organization, because in order to have an effective strike, you have to control the supply of labor. Otherwise, it doesn't work. I mean, you're going to have people coming in. I forget what they call them, scabs, I guess, in the factories. I'm not sure what you call them in the transport sector, but it's tough to have that choke point, when you have like something like a truck. And to this day, there's a lot of non-unionized truckers, independent owner-operators, people like that. So how does that work? I mean, how do you get people organized? Because in a factory, it's like, okay, everybody's like in one place. But in trucking or something like that, you're all over. So I remember the UPS strikes, but that was like one company.
Back then, I think there was more peer-to-peer communication. I think the word of mouth traveled a lot farther. People were more in tune to gossip and what they're hearing on the street. The other thing is those guys were not making a whole lot of money. They were living in poverty. And, if they see a chance to where, hey, we can break the company, we can get more money, the threat of violence for crossing that picket line is a pretty good motivator to keep everybody in line. And the other thing that you need to have for a strike to work is the craft or the job has to be at least somewhat skilled. Something where just any old person could walk in off the street and do it,
Yeah.
Like, even though it might not seem like much, there was some skill involved to, maneuver a team of 8 horses through the city streets.
Yeah. Yeah, especially like the roads weren't paved and you had to go through kind of all these weird back alleys, and there's no GPS, so you had to know where to go. So yeah. I mean, getting a guy you can trust who knows how to get there on time, that sort of thing.
That's sort of my problem with the service employees internationally. I don't like those guys. And what they represent, like dishwashers and hotel maids. I mean, how can you be an effective bargaining unit with a bunch of dishwashers?
Right.
Or the janitors union. I feel like those low skill jobs really don't deserve unions at all.
Most of American labor history, from my reading of it, and most of English labor history, if you read in particular Richard Heilbroner's book, Worldly Philosophers, I know I've mentioned it on the show before, highly, highly recommend everyone read it. He has several good historical introspectives into England and France throughout the Middle Ages, even into the late medieval era, into the 16th century. And his reading of European labor guild history is effectively that before the rise of what you would call industrial capitalism or industrial economics, the idea of having land, labor, and capital being abstract entities was unheard of, completely unheard of. The idea that you would be forced to unionize or to join the guild was sort of unheard of as well. guilds or labor organizations, they're better probably called trade federations. And in some countries today, you still have that term being used. Denmark is one in particular. You were joining these organizations typically of your own will, but normally if your father was involved in the trade, or your grandfather was involved in the trade, or your uncle was involved in the trade.
Well, my understanding was you wanted to, because that was the only way you could learn the skills. I mean, it was sort of an apprenticeship model. So
right.
in order to become a shoesmith, you're really going to have to work for a guy who knows how to do it, because otherwise your shoes are going to fall apart. They're going to look stupid. So that sort of thing. I mean, they didn't have broad mass education, and people just worked since they were, they could pick up a hammer. It was like 8 years old. Just you're an apprentice now. So that was what you did, and there was really not a lot of choice. I mean, people had to work. So I think that probably motivated a lot of people to join those things.
Correct. And you certainly didn't have these notions of, I think, collective bargaining. What you did have were local organizations. Obviously, they could be in some ways connected through their trade specialty to other organizations in the respective country. And this is really before nation states. So the respective kingdom or related kingdom, but they were very decentralized. In order to get something done in a local area, you had to contract, or you had to basically negotiate with this local guild. And they didn't necessarily operate the same way that the same, let's say, nail-making guild did 3 towns over. They might operate totally differently. Now, if you want to make something local, you have to deal with them. What this ends up shifting into once you hit industrial capitalism is, first, a lot of these organizations are destroyed. They're either destroyed through bribery, they're destroyed through economic planning. In some cases, you have government edicts that are basically wiping them out. You start to see labor reorganizing in a similar way locally or somewhat nationally, but it's still it's less of a legal organization and more of a organization of common courtesy. In the early United States, even
what do you mean by common courtesy organization?
So you didn't necessarily have expansive charters and expansive legal contracts between different organizations, including these labor organizations. You didn't necessarily have that, and you certainly didn't have that in the early United States. So one of the first examples was, I think, the Boston Shoemakers Union in 1648. That organization did not have a complex legal framework with the Massachusetts State Charter or the Massachusetts Colonial Charter. Mm-hmm. The way that you have these federal and state and municipal regulations, overlapping regulations on how labor unions operate, how they coordinate with private companies, public organizations, that was also unheard of. So the slow buildup of labor organizations, labor unions, particularly in the United States and in England, has a lot to do with just increasing scale and increasing problems. Well, how do we deal with, now that we have this big national labor pool, now that we've determined our economic system to have an abstract form of labor? How do we deal with that in the industrial economy? Well, you have to create laws about this, and as this municipality grows, has a couple factories in it, well, we have to create municipal laws. We need federal regulations about how municipal laws apply. You start to see how these things build up, and labor union leadership just basically operates in a very weird, murky zone with local, state, and federal politicians. But it was never really intended to be this way from my reading.
Yeah, I think that's right. Where do we go from here? I think I can give maybe a little bit more background on the history in the United States, at least, of where labor was moving. I think the 1920s were kind of interesting because it was relatively a time of prosperity for at least the middle class in America, but it was still a very industrialized country. And there were still a lot of mines. I mean, West Virginia, there was a great railroad strike in 1922. But that seemed to change in the Great Depression, because I think what happened was there just wasn't enough work. And when you have, and I can give the example of the Ford factory, Ford was actually trying to give people employment. His priority was to give them a job as opposed to pay them more, because if you have $100 to give out to employees and each person can makes 10, you can have 10 employees, right? But if you only have $100 and each person wants $20, you can only employ 5 people. So that concept was sort of in effect during the Depression, because the car sales were down, I think, by at least 50%, and he simply could not afford to pay these people. So he ended up sort of doing these kind of like work holidays, where you would only work 3 days a week, okay, but at least you can keep a job. And they kept striking. They kept complaining about that. And they wanted more money. And to me, that seems really ridiculous, because it's like, if you open up the books at least, and maybe he didn't do that, it's like, look, there's only so much money to go around, and if I think it's better that you guys have at least something versus nothing. But that concept didn't seem to work too well. But I think, at least in that case, but I think overall, I think unionization was in a weakened state because of just the general downturn during the Depression. There's sort of an interesting quote I found about that, which I'll need to find in my notes. But Mike, what do you think about the Depression and how it affects sort of unions? I mean, when you're going through a hard time economically, and that would include the employer if his sales are zero all of a sudden. To give the extreme example, there has to be some like reasoning back and forth, right? So like, what is the proper response, would you say, from the union in a situation like that?
Well, in a situation like that, there has to be concessions. You don't want to kill the goose that laid the golden egg. Right. Yeah, if you look at what happened when Hoffa went to jail and Frank Fitzsimmons took over the Teamsters union, he went and he doubled and sometimes almost tripled the wages for the union truck drivers under the master freight agreement. And what that did is that put a whole lot of trucking companies out of business. Yep. In the union overall. But yeah, back to the Depression. During the Depression is when you see the most violent sort of strikes, with the street violence and the private detectives and the police shooting people, and the unions beating people with bats. I think they had the Minnesota General Strike of 1934. I think 1934 had a San Francisco General Strike also, and that was just madness. There was blood in the streets, And it was the people, the workers. They weren't getting enough money. They weren't getting enough work. People were just fed up. People were out in the streets.
Yeah. It's interesting that in Europe, especially, the kind of communist organizers were having much more success than in the United States. I found that quote, and it basically goes, one might have expected a reincarnation of organizations seeking to overthrow the capitalistic system that was now performing so poorly. Some workers did indeed turn to such radical movements as the Communist Party, but in general, the nation seemed to have been shocked into inaction. Why do you think there's that difference? There was a book about France called Every Factory a Fortress, and there was a lot of communism involved during that period, and they even were able to organize a 4 million person general strike, which is unheard of in the United States.
Especially in the Pacific Northwest, up in the Washington, Seattle area, it was just completely red.
Hi, Nick.
Hey guys, how are you?
Nick's computer is cooperating now.
Sorry, I had some computer problems.
So could you elaborate on that? What do you mean? So the Northwest had a lot of communists?
Yes. Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, I'm catching up on what you guys are talking about, but I mean, the whole socialism and communism and the labor movement seems to me entirely motivated by the material claims of communism and socialism as to what it can deliver to the workers.
But why there, not the other regions?
Wasn't really about. Oh, I don't know. I just know the history in particular.
Huh. Interesting.
I mean, there were certainly other regions that had plenty of. I mean, you had everything from the anarchist activities in the upper Midwest and in the East Coast. I mean, there's all over the country.
Yeah, was it Seiko Vanzetti? He was an anarchist in New York, something like that.
Yeah, Seiko and Vanzetti, and you had the Haymarket bombing, and other kinds of various assassinations that took place.
I think a lot of it fell along ethnic lines too. If you look at the Haymarket bombing, you'll see the people involved in that were mostly German, Polish, and maybe Scandinavian immigrants. And the immigrants back then were treated horribly. You know, they would get paid half or a quarter of what an American-born person would make for the same job.
That's why they were there. I mean,
yeah.
that's why they were imported. I mean, shit, they're doing the same thing now. Pay them less.
Yeah, it's sort of funny though, looking back and seeing, you know, those German and Irish immigrants just getting treated like garbage, and you see, well, you know, maybe being white in America hasn't always been such an easy ride.
Yeah.
You know, they didn't care about skin color back then.
I mean, at the end of the day, nobody really cares. It's just, how does it affect me? And I think when it comes to making money, the people that have a lot of it usually want to get more. But people with little money want more too. So it's just usually the people who have a lot are usually pretty good at it, and the ones that get up to the top usually are pretty ruthless. So that seems to be a pattern.
That's something else that I've noticed about union workers and union bargaining units is that the more money that a worker or the workers in that bargaining unit make, the better paid they are, the more organized they're going to be, and the better contracts they're going to get.
Right.
Because the way it is now in America, you have less than 1% of union members ever bother going to a union meeting. You ask people, are you in a union? And a lot of times what you'll hear them say is, yes, I am. And you'll say, well, which union? They'll say, well, gee, I don't know. It's some union. I work over here. I don't know what union I'm in. And that's the way the leadership wants it. The leadership doesn't want people to be involved.
Yeah, that makes sense.
They hate it when you go to union meetings.
Well, sure, you start asking questions. They don't like that.
Oh, yeah. You know, what a lot of people don't realize is that by going to union meetings, you can change the Constitution and the bylaws of your local union just by standing up and making a point of order. As long as you got someone next to you to second that point of order, you can take it to a vote.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of times you bring 5 or 6 guys into a union meeting, you can change the rules of your local. So any union guys out there who aren't happy with your local, that's something that you can do.
Well, what would be something that you could actually put forward as a proposal that would realistically be accepted? I mean, do you have any?
Well, yeah, like the right for the members to see a contract before they vote on it. That's a big one. You know, before the reform union. Yeah, before the reform union, there's a guy named Ken Paff, who I casually know. He started the Teamsters for a Democratic Union back in like the 1970s, something like that. So he's based in Detroit, right down the street from Jimmy Hoffa's Local 299. You know, Jimmy Hoffa is also the secretary-treasurer of the Local 299 car haulers, in addition to being the president of the International. So Ken Paff has been a pain in the ass. Before Ken Paff and the Teamsters for a Democratic Union, the members were not allowed to vote for any of the national officers. What would happen is that, you know, the cronies in the union hall would just, hey, you know, I want to nominate this guy to be the delegate to go to Las Vegas to the convention. And so the delegates would be the ones who voted, you know. And before Ron Kerry came along in the 1970s, they could push through any contract they wanted on the workers as long as it didn't have a 3/4 majority voting against it. If you have 63% of the workers voting against the contract, it would still get ratified. And it took outside reformers to make those changes. Yeah,
I mean that 1% number is pretty striking about the attendance to the meetings. As that trended down? I mean, like, and why?
That's absolutely. Now, see, what got me involved in this? I've always been sort of a little bit paying attention to unions, but I was part of 2 big companies that merged together that were both Teamster employees, and me and my coworkers, after going to the union meeting talking about the merger, we realized, hey, we're getting fucked, and our own union is doing it to us. You know, we had the Tony Andrews, the secretary treasurer of the Local 305 here in Portland. He's also the president of the Joint Council. He told us if we don't vote yes for this piece of shit contract, that he would have his freight haulers from another company pull our loads. He basically said he would bring in other Teamsters, his guys, to break our strike if we dare go against him.
What Jesus. But why was it a bad contract? What specifically was not good for you?
Well, it was a concessionary contract. A lot of language having to do with bid and dispatch rules, pay.
Yeah.
You know, they wanted us to go to this arcane pay system that was just very arbitrary. Didn't make sense. You wouldn't know how much money you're making at the end of the day.
Huh. Why do you think he was for that?
Well, what it is you see, union leaders are just like every other human being, is that they're lazy, and they want to take the path of least resistance.
Okay.
So if you're in Oregon and you're going to start a new franchise or a new branch of your company that you know is going to go union because it's historically always been a union employer, what you do is you go to the local 305 and you say, "Hey guys, let's talk," because that's the union in town that plays ball. And so they're not. There's no mafia in Oregon or the West Coast. There's nothing corrupt. It's just these guys in polo shirts, and it doesn't take much to get them to flip. I mean, you give these guys Super Bowl tickets or invite to the Playboy Mansion, or you just invite them to go on a weekend golf getaway.
Yeah.
And these guys will throw in concessions worth millions of dollars.
Well, I guess you have an incentives problem. I mean, basically, the union members are not really. I mean, you guys basically should be able to withhold your dues or something, because that's the problem. He's not representing you. He's representing himself because he's getting bribed effectively by the companies. So, like, there's a big disconnect there. I mean, you guys basically have to. I don't think you should pool the dues. Like, I think you should pay them directly. Like, look, you're fired now. You're not helping us. That's how I would see it.
When I went through this, I started reading everything I could on what kind of recourse does a worker have when against their own local union. And there's nothing out there. I mean, I read the National Labor Relations Act. I read the LMRDA. I read just, industrial common law. I read everything I get my hands on. And the only thing that I could figure out was that you got to throw them out in an election. The only way you can get rid of them is through the election. And that's what we did.
Yeah.
We ran against them, and they cheated way better than we did. we lost by a landslide.
Oh shit!
How did they cheat? What did they do to rig that?
I have a pretty good idea that what they did is they have a list of the addresses of every member, and I think that when they send out the flyers before the ballots go out, because it's a ballot that comes in the mail like an absentee ballot. I think when they sent out their campaign literature first, the campaign literature that came back to them with a bad address, I think what they did is they marked those addresses down, and when the ballots went out, they went around in the middle of the night on like a Sunday night and started pulling those letters out of the mailbox and marking the ballots.
Oh, wow.
I think it was some of that, and I have a hunch. I have a hunch that, you see, there's a very strong chain of custody with these ballots. We're talking like federal crimes here. And I think that what happened is I think that somebody had an inside person at the post office. So the post office has like a special locked box where they will keep these union ballots until the day of the election, at which time, all parties go to the post office together and bring them back to the hall to be counted. And I think that somebody had an old lady or a brother-in-law or something that worked at the local post office and was able to change some votes around.
Jeez.
Because, if you look at how many votes we got, it was ridiculous. I mean, we had more people give us money than what voted for us.
I mean, is there actually, well, we don't have to get into too much of the legal stuff, but it's like, you mentioned the National Labor Relations Act. There's a whole bunch of these. I mean, let me just go through the list. Is that illegal, like, under those laws? I mean, because it's not a government election, it's like a private election. But yeah.
That's a big time federal crime. Yeah.
Okay. Under those sort of like statutes that were set up during the Depression kind of thing. Do you know if that's where it's coming from? Because, like, for example, like if we all like formed a club and then, let's vote on the leader, and then, I like rigged it. I don't think that's a federal crime, right? So I'm just saying, like, there has to be some consideration.
Yeah, labor organizations fall under federal jurisdiction.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right, so let me read off a couple here. So there was the Norris LaGuardia Anti-Injunction Act of 1932. What was happening was kind of the sort of companies were kind of making it very difficult for the kind of hearings to be brought to court, and they were getting kind of like the injunctions passed to kind of stop the discussions. That was sort of smoothed over with this act. There was another one in 1933, the National Industrial Recovery Act. Employees shall have the right to organize and bargain collectively through representative of their own choosing, and shall be free from the interference, restraint, or coercion of employers. They probably should add union to that list. That was deemed unconstitutional in 1935 to be then replaced by the Whannell Act 2 months later, which was also called the National Labor Relations Act of 1935. I think that's the one you're mentioning. That created the National Labor Relations Board, and the NLRB has two basic functions. It oversees the process by which employees decide whether to be represented by a labor organization, and prosecuting violations. So I guess they would supposedly be the group you would go to for a violation here.
Well, in 1935, you also had the National Labor Standards Act, and that's what basically made union busting illegal, and businesses could no longer prohibit or even trifle with the idea of their employees forming a union. Because if you remember, when on the Progressive Era episode, we talked about the antitrust regulations were actually used against big unions, ironically enough, throughout most of the early years of Sherman antitrust being in effect. It was mostly used against labor organizations.
Well, I mean, that's in theory kind of the same idea as a monopoly. I mean, it's again, it's like if you're not prioritizing the distribution of wealth, you're sort of like you're looking at the kind of concentration of power, then you would sort of recognize that somewhat justly, but that's sort of debatable. I had a couple more things historically we could kind of just set the outline for. There was obviously World War II kind of changed things a lot, because I mean when you're sort of in a total war, which the United States sort of was. I mean, it wasn't really fighting on its own soil, but nonetheless, the entire kind of government got involved in private industry to coordinate and command and control the production apparatus of the United States. The shortages of workers, in theory, could have maybe allowed for strikes, but I think they might have been busted up because of the sort of war situation. But right after the war ended, the strikes started up big time.
Well, there was legislation during the war that just no strikes were allowed.
I figured as much. Yeah, that would make sense. Yeah, but afterwards, they were having big strikes, and so
also the World War II period, right after the war ended, that's when you saw the highest point of union membership in America.
Yeah, that would make sense. I wanted to mention the Taft-Hartley Act, which Truman tried to veto, actually, but it was basically passed over his veto by Congress. And what that did was it kind of outlawed closed shops, which were requiring you to join the union even if you didn't want to. And that was called very derisively by Truman as sort of like a slave labor act. But there was sort of a historian, this is according to Wikipedia, James T. Patterson, that said basically it was no more disastrous for workers than the Whannell Act had been for employers. I'm just quoting this now. What ordinarily mattered most in labor relations was not government laws, such as Taft-Hartley, but the relative power of unions and management in the economic marketplace. Where unions were strong, they usually managed all right. When they were weak, new laws did them little additional harm. I think that's probably correct, but go ahead. Yeah,
that's sort of what they call right to work nowadays. In your right to work states, if you're in a union shop, you don't have to pay dues. But if you look at, like, say, Washington State, for example, now Washington is a right to work state, but when you read the right to work laws, one of the things in there says your employer can fire you for any reason, anytime, whenever they want to.
Yeah.
Also, keep in mind that throughout the Depression, you saw the gradual merging of labor union interests and Democratic Party interests. So for Truman, to criticize that legislation was basically trying to fight for his coalition. Him and Wallace and FDR had mostly built their wartime coalition around the labor unions.
But if you look at what's going on nowadays, American labor's involvement in politics is a complete joke. Now, American unions spend more on elections than all other labor movements in the rest of the world combined. And yet, the last piece of truly significant pro-worker legislation was OSHA, passed in 1970 under Richard Nixon.
Right.
So what it comes down to is, it really is a joke. You go to the union hall, and all these guys are Trump supporters. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
These unions, they give all this big money to the Democratic Party, and it seems to be just sort of a get-out-of-jail-free card. Because what you see is the refusal of liberals and progressives to really probe the sources of organized labor's failure. And it just shows they don't take their own political vocation seriously. You know, you never hear anybody talking on the House floor talking about union corruption.
No, I mean, the whole sort of Democratic Republican parties are, in our opinions, I think at this point, fairly clear, very corrupt, and they seem to have sort of merged almost. There's very little. Well, I would also say this, though. It's not so much necessarily a merger. They've kind of moved away from their traditional positions in the sense that, the Republicans used to even be for protectionism. They used to kind of want to keep tariffs high to keep industry in the United States. That's gone away. I mean, they're basically free traders now. And the Democrats used to be more for that too, and they were obviously much more supportive of unions, at least in theory, than it is now. But I mean, you have people like Bill Clinton passing George Bush Sr.'s NAFTA for him, and there's a lot of collusion between those two, which we don't need to get into. But the point is, there's so much coordination at the high level.
When it comes to the stuff that really matters, when they fuck over the American worker, they always agree on it. You look at the last election, the only two candidates who were against the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, were Trump and Bernie Sanders. Right. And to Trump's credit, I think it was like his first or his second day in office. Yep. He vetoed TPP, got it out of there.
Yeah, he did. And obviously, go ahead.
It's two wings of the bird of prey.
What do you mean?
Yeah, everything that matters.
The Democrat and Republican parties. They're two wings of the same bird of prey.
Yeah,
okay. But I was going to ask about, I think that the Democrat Party really believed that they had the unions on lock completely because
take them for granted.
I have a friend, this is the first I had heard about this, but I have a friend who's actually listening to the show who mentioned that his mother was she would receive like these ballots that were basically already filled out, like for her, voting. I think her husband or something was a union member at some point, or something to that effect. And they would basically have the ballots already filled out. She would just kind of sign off on them and send them out. So they would essentially be voting for her.
Yeah, I've heard of other stories like that. I mean, there's certain districts in the ghetto where they'll basically just give you like a cheat sheet when you walk in to pull the lever. I mean, it's clear like the democracy is basically just kind of like a safety valve for the kind of ruling class to give people the impression that they have any power. But everybody's so misinformed by the media and it's just so overwhelmed in terms of like, how the hell do I have time to study this?
Well, it's pretty obvious the Democratic Party is running into the conflict between its traditional support, or at least nominal support of unions, and their platform of infinity immigration.
Right. I mean, I don't know how they square the economic positions of Tom Steyer with their union support, that they do not coalesce in any way.
The
unions trying to spin it in such a way that, hey, all these illegals are going to make great union members. Sort of like the Democrats say, all these illegals are going to make great Democratic voters. That's the way they spin it. The unions don't really care. You're working out the assumption there that the unions care about their members.
Yeah. So after Taft-Hartley, this was sort of like the peak of the union movement, and in 1955, at least, 1/3 of Americans were unionized. By 2017, less than 7% were in the private sector. Today, interestingly enough, most unions are in the public sector. So whether it's the teachers or I guess federal workers union, whatever that thing is called.
AFDME.
Yeah. So why do you think that is? Why do you think the public sector has it all now and the private sector is basically gone?
I think the corporations have done a good job of getting rid of the unions. People aren't informed. Young people don't know about the benefits of union membership. And these employers are very, very anti-union. I can tell you that there is a certain supermarket chain and national supermarket chain, and in Washington State they opened a new store. And the workers of that store all signed card checks and had a majority vote to join the grocery workers union. And the very next day, the store manager called everybody into the back room and said, "You're all fired."
Yeah, I've heard stories about that, like at places like Walmart. I don't know if unions exist at all in Amazon, but they've been kind of making the headlines recently.
Recently, there's been actually it was leaked. There have been emails going around between senior staff members of Whole Foods, basically trying to campaign for unionization. They seemed the smarter ones seem to understand Bezos's game and what he's done to a lot of the Amazon warehouse workers. So they're trying to unionize before it's too late, and he finds a way to basically prevent any sort of labor reform from happening in Whole Foods.
And I'll be honest with you, this is sort of a pet theory of mine. I think people just view union membership as lower status. I think people go to college and they expect to be kind of like some kind of high-powered lawyer, and then the reality is they end up working at Whole Foods, and they're like, well, fuck, if I joined a union, I mean, Jesus Christ, it's like, what the hell just happened to my 4 years I wasted at college? I do think there is an element there. I do.
When you join the union, you're basically, I think in a lot of ways, you're committing to that profession as your career. So then you're committing, in some part, the career of your life to working as manual labor in Whole Foods. And maybe you move up to management, maybe you don't. But I think that there's a lot of apprehension on millennials, people in their 20s and 30s right now. Do I really want to make my career at Whole Foods? Yeah,
I think everybody wants to be white collar, and we've sort of been misled to think that everybody can be white collar, and that's, I think, holding back a lot of people. I really do.
There's a lot of misinformation out there, too. You'll hear truck drivers say, "Oh, I'll be damned if I'm going to pay union dues." They act like that $50 a month is going to be a big chunk out of their money. And you look at, say, a union carpenter. Okay, I used to be in the carpenters union up in Seattle. You look at a union carpenter, and they make more than the average person with a 4-year college degree.
Oh yeah,
it's true.
A union carpenter makes like $70,000 a year.
How much?
Like $70,000 a year.
That's good.
It depends on the seniority, how long you've been there. Depends how much. Will depend on how many hours you get. But a union carpenter's making $40 an hour.
Yeah, that's great. It's good money.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's God, I mean, I really also view it as just the nature of the work has changed a lot. People are not engaged in manual labor, not just for sort of choice, but also I don't know what the hell the American economy does anymore. I mean, to me, it just seems like a big sham and a real estate game. But
immigration has changed things a lot.
That's definitely true. I was also just going to mention the sort of offshoring. I do think the deindustrialization of the country has sort of pushed people into offices, and I think that type of work is much more less regimented, and so people again don't feel that sense of solidarity. People are like, not doing the same thing as the other guy, and so there's kind of more rivalry, it seems. And definitely the immigration has put more pressure on it. I mean, since the 70s, I think that was the peak of kind of like the U.S. manufacturing sector, and also the sort of share of the GDP of labor as well. And so
that was right before steadily. Wage growth started to stagnate.
Yeah,
wage growth for a lot of professions began to stagnate sometime in the 1970s. You see, it's kind of a feedback loop that becomes worse and worse over time. as the country started to deindustrialize, somewhat in response to labor unions, I think, but also some of it was purely a calculation on the part of what's called the industrial class, the managerial class, that there was a point at which it was time to shift labor concerns to something that was just cheaper. Around that time, you started to see the rise in, okay, you got to go to college, you got to be white collar, you got to, there's this whole financial industry to join, there's this burgeoning tech industry to join. People started to think, well, manufacturing, don't really want to go into that, don't really want to go into the trades, don't really want to drive a truck. Next generation comes along, they've seen the previous generations manage to do well without having done any of that, so that none of them join, or very few of them join. So unions start to lose their power, industrialization completely stops. Basic things like logistics, mechanics, those are all in decline. You need basically bring people in through immigration in order to fill them.
Logistics has maintained its employment, but I'm not sure what you mean by decline.
Well, there's a nationwide shortage. They say we're about 50,000 truck drivers short in America.
Yeah. The decline in the number of people willing to go into it, and decline, I think, in the respectability of the trade.
Right. Yeah.
The idea that you are not going to go be a financial analyst with Bank of America is a massive fucking ego blow to a lot of people, and I can't stress it enough. If I told half the kids who are in the finance program at my university, hey, you know what? You're going to go be a carpenter, you're going to go be a truck driver instead, I'd say a good portion of them probably commit suicide. Like, they really have no conception of wanting to ever do anything like that.
Well, this gets to what's so fucked up about the United States. I mean, I don't know if I can boil it down to one thing, but I think a lot of it is the culture of Hollywood, and that people grow up, and I'm no different than this. I mean, fuck, like, I used to watch movies like Wall Street, Gordon Gekko, Charlie Sheen, and shit like that, and you were like, oh yeah, that's going to be me. I'm going to be a captain of industry, or I'm going to be a master of the universe. I think that's the term they called them. These guys wearing these power suspenders and ties and dating Daryl Hannah. I mean, who the hell wouldn't want to do that as opposed to driving a truck? But it's like, look, man, it's like
I'd rather drive a truck.
Yeah, maybe. Well, maybe you can make the pitch, but I'm just trying to say, like, the glamorization of that stuff is very part and parcel of the American culture. And I think if you look at more sane countries where, for whatever reason, they haven't gotten into that, places like Germany, I mean, they have like a 2% unemployment rate, and they even have like sort of a somewhat legit case for bringing in workers, but I mean, it's not going to help the workers who are already there, obviously. And the system they have, the education system, is much more reasonable because it doesn't send everybody to college. It basically has 3 tracks. It's I forget what they're called, but the college one is called like Abitur, and there's 2 other ones, and they're basically like, okay, you're going to trade school, you're going to like you're not even going to go to college, or you're going to go to college, but it's tracked for a lot of different people, and as opposed to America where it's like 100% college, which is absurd, absolutely absurd.
Well, there's a lot more rigidity in the American system, and it's not necessarily forced rigidity, although it's certainly culturally reinforced rigidity. Like, I can't remember the last time I saw a movie where the main character was an American who was a factory worker or a mechanic. It was like a movie that
Christian Bale and The Machinist, but I don't even think people know what machinists are anymore.
Well, Adam, I was going to say I was more inspired by Jack Burton than I was by Gordon Gekko.
Who's that?
Big Kurt Russell in Big Trouble in Little China.
Yeah, that's not a job though.
Yeah, Pork Chop Express.
He's a truck driver, man.
That's
the whole character.
Yeah, but I mean, the movie's about him, like, like shooting harpoons from his air pistol or something at like
just another day driving a truck, man.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, now what about the difference between American unions and European unions? You'll notice that in Europe, you don't see nearly the amount of corruption that you see in America.
Right.
The European unions, there's a little bit of corruption, an official here, or an official there, but it's not a widespread, institutionalized sort of corruption that you have in America.
Why do you think that is?
There's a quote that I read, and it said something to the effect that, getting caught taking a bribe as a union official will get you fired, but complaining about other people taking bribes will also get you fired.
Well, that sounds like there's speech laws in the UK talking about.
Well, and every country in the European Union has laws that mandate work councils that will allow the workers to have a say and determine their work rules and their working conditions. And the American wage workers have no power. We lack any influence at all over corporate management.
And that's absolutely true. That's another thing in Germany that I'm aware of. They have kind of seats at the kind of like the board of directors level. But I actually posed this to a union leader. It was he was actually one of the International Longshoremen's Union, the guys that periodically will shut down the west coast of the United States for ports, basically, like all the shipping containers coming in that get picked up by these cranes. If you shut that down, I mean, global commerce on that part of the country shuts down, and because we're pretty
not
heavily
necessarily.
dependent.
Now they tried that in Portland a few years ago, and the port operator said, "Fine, we'll shut the port down. Have a nice day."
Who tried what? What do you mean?
Well, the longshoremen's had a dispute with the electrician unions over who does the temperature check on the refrigerated trailers at the dock.
Mm-hmm.
The longshoremen said, "Fuck this, we're going on strike." The port operator said, "Fine, we'll just shut this whole terminal down. We're not dealing with you guys anymore."
Okay.
So now all that stuff is just getting trucked up from Tacoma or whatever.
Right. Well, that's a good example of kind of how
and it's a good example of
down,
the union overstepping and wanting too much. Now these guys were going on strike over what amounted to about 6 jobs that were already being done by union electricians, but the longshoremen wanted those 6 jobs, and now nobody has any jobs.
Well, I'll tell you the truth. I actually don't like that union. I think they're greedy motherfuckers because they basically they sit in a goddamn box, okay, and they move a crane handle back and forth to pick up other boxes. That is an unskilled job, and basically they get paid.
No, I would disagree on it.
You know how much they get paid though? They get paid like $150,000. All right.
Oh, yeah, they do make good money
compared to a guy who's got a PhD. He's making less. I mean, that's ridiculous. Those guys are greedy.
Compared to me, who's got a bachelor's of science, I make like a third of that.
Oh.
Those guys are greedy. But I will defend them.
I'm all for working, making some good money.
Yeah.
But I'm just saying, they should have been happy with what they had and not pushed it too far.
Sure. No, I will defend them if they don't want automation. There's a lot of technology out there that can basically make those cranes do it without a worker, just to underscore the fact that they're lucky to have that job. And I'm fine with them having a job. That's fine. But for fuck's sake, dude, like, you don't need that much. You don't need a raise over that when everybody else is making half that. I mean, come on, So that's all my point is.
No, they did kind of overstep it a little bit.
Yeah, but what the reason I brought it up was I actually talked to one of the guys who was one of the leaders in the union, and and he's making the case about how bad management is. And I'm like, okay, I'm sure there's a lot of assholes, who you have to deal with. But what would you say to the concept of how they have kind of these work councils in Europe? I mean, would it be better if you guys could actually cooperate a little bit? And he's like, well, that would be nice, but it just doesn't seem to happen. And I'm like, well, I don't know why that is. I mean, I'm not blaming him, but I'm just asking the question.
In Europe, they have laws.
Yeah.
And that's why we have no laws that mandate that sort of thing.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's a good point. I wonder if that would even do it, but America is just kind of a very disunited place. I think that's part of it.
Well,
people.
I think a big difference too is, like LaFond always points out, is that people in America have that slave mentality.
Yeah, and don't know it. Yeah, but yeah.
Oh, and it's just like, well, I can't do anything about it. I just do what the boss says, and I'm lucky. Hey, listen, these people running these corporations, don't fool yourself. If they could find a way to get you to work for free, they would do it.
Oh, sure.
You're nothing but a number.
I was looking at I don't know if I have time to pull it up, but it was, I'll just kind of like paraphrase it. It was a a stunning example of this. And look, I've lived this. Okay, I've had these unpaid internships. And I remember my father asking me, well, why aren't they paying you? I'm like, look, it's not 1970 anymore. All right. You know, the power of labor is low in America, but I don't think I was that aware back then, but this was, when I was in college. But this, there's a job listing for kind of like researching like slavery, modern slavery. And it's an unpaid internship.
Was that right next to the job listing for the research position, looking into irony?
I mean, it's like, at what point do we sort of question the system? It's truly astonishing how fucked up the lives
we have to ask
the average guy is.
Question: What is power? And power is the capacity to make others act contrary to their will. Now, the boss has all the power. The worker has none. And equity in the workplace is something that is just not present in a non-union environment. Unless you're working for like a small business, a mom-and-pop outfit that are good people.
Sure.
Just look at Amazon. Amazon is the future,
Dude, I people literally put those goddamn Alexa things in their home. I mean, that's a spy device. I mean, the guy who runs that company, I've crossed paths with him without going into more detail, and he gives me the creeps. Okay, and people really need to connect the dots when they look at companies. They're not just these sort of like amorphous blobs. They're run by people, and you need to understand who's running them and what sort of agendas they're pursuing. Same thing with Facebook. I mean, he called his users dumb fucks. So are we surprised? Apparently some people are surprised.
Right?
No, he's right, but I mean that's how they view these people they control. I mean, they're not your friend. So people need to be much more skeptical.
The white collars aren't really doing much better. I mean, this is essentially the H-1B phenomenon, why there was a lot of, you could call them tech worker support, like the Disney tech workers support for Trump. And I've experienced this myself. I remember I was applying for an internship at let's just call it one of the big four accounting firms, but I was going to apply as a data science intern. And I get into this boardroom. I go up to the offices, get in this boardroom, and they're introducing all the other people who are applying for that internship to each other. Like a room of 8 of us. I'm the only white American who speaks great English.
You speak great English, Hans. You speak great English.
I was gonna pants you for
that. Thanks.
Actually, Hans is very articulate, so I will.
Yeah, so
not pants you, but keep going.
3 of the guys were from somewhere in probably the Indian subcontinent. I don't know what. The other 4 were East Asians of some kind. They were all in an MBA program or a master's program. I was the only kid. I was 20, who was still in his bachelor's program and trying to get my first real data science internship.
Better raise your game, Goy. What's wrong with
you?
Can I make
a libertarian answer?
Turned out?
Huh?
What's up?
Can I make a on how that job interview turned out?
So
something tells me you didn't get the gig.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I knew guys who worked there, and the reason I got into these final round interviews is mostly because of them. And obviously, I didn't get the job, and then they told me that one of the Chinese kids did, and then he promptly quit like 3.5 months later to get an even better job that he lined himself up for at some outfit of HSBC in the area. So, I mean, I've experienced this myself, and even if you're a white collar, even if you're a modern tech worker, you have very little labor power. There's almost no way for you to coordinate with other people.
Yep.
The Disney tech worker story is kind of remarkable in that they actually stuck together, but typically you don't see that.
Well, but the reason why they stuck together is because they all knew
right
that the match was falling. They had nothing to lose.
Which is rare, and it was actually probably a miscalculation on Disney's part to do that all at once. What a lot of firms will do is basically death by paper cut. They'll prune here, they'll bring in someone here, they'll bring in a product manager, from, Brazil or whoever, and that guy knows another guy who he went to school with who is Pakistani, and he doesn't want to work for as much, so why don't we bring him in and get rid of the old systems engineer? You start to see this like slow implosion of the domestic workforce, even at the white collar level.
Well, and if you look at the big picture, something I'm always thinking about is the cost that this takes on society, where at what point do these masters of the universe not realize that all their money is going to be worth nothing without a stable society in which to enjoy it in?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we can already see where this goes. If you've traveled to places like Brazil or India, I mean, the people who have all this money, they don't live with the rest of the people. They have walled compounds, and literally, I was in Mumbai and I heard this helicopter going over us. I'm like, who's that? Oh, that's Mukesh Ambani. He takes a helicopter to work because the roads are unusable. They're full of these people living literally on the road, by the side of the road. You have this just Blade Runner type of system, and I guess these guys don't care. I mean, I guess they're wealthy enough, but the people in the middle are really losing what they historically had, at least in the United States. And it is a hyper unstable system when you have this massive distribution or concentration, lack of sort of even distribution of wealth. And it's eventually people are going to be like, look, it's not worth it for me to follow your orders anymore.
Hey, look, I've been saying for the last 10 years that society's not going to crumble. We're not going to have tanks in the streets. We're not going to have civil war. What's going to happen is that we're going to turn into South America, and you're already starting to see that on the West Coast, where you have $1 million houses, and then down the road you have people living in tents.
Oh,
and
that's
going to be the trend. That's the road that we're going to be going down. We're going to end up just like South America.
Yeah. And it's that sort of it's that aspirational class that is stuck in this kind of mind fuck where they think they can still make it to that upper class, but they're not. And there's a headline. Go ahead.
Because this is nobody I know. I mean,
no, I look. I mean, if you go to a 4-year university, this is the aspirational class. The only reason you put up with that bullshit is because you want to get into a higher rung of society. I mean, there's no reason.
But what's their socioeconomic background? I mean, are they
suburban,
upper middle class?
Suburban, maybe middle class usually, and they want to kind of strive to get up. I mean, it's kind of a yuppie thing, I guess, but a lot of kids. What's that?
Like the sons of doctors and the sons of bankers.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a sizable chunk. I mean, I would say a lot of the alt-right comes from that, frankly.
What's funny is, in my experience, I've had almost no dealings with those people. Almost everybody that I talk to or deal with in my day-to-day life for my entire life has been, lower class, homeless, or, very, like myself, very, very lower middle class.
Yeah, I mean,
what does that say?
That was the majority of the country was, lower class or, very, very lower middle class.
What does that say about the state of civic society in America? I think, what's his name? Charles Murray's book, Coming Apart, he talks about this, that class divides are so apparent now that people from various classes flat out have no contact with one another. They just simply... They simply don't understand one another. They don't understand each other's incentives. There's no like cross-class friendships anymore. Your friend circle, your church circle, it's all related.
I went to Disneyland, and I felt like I was in outer space, man. I saw all these people, and most of them were Indian or Persian, but everybody at Disneyland was rich. They all had shiny white teeth, and I felt like I was in a different country,
No, I've felt that way for years now. I mean, who is the guy on YouTube who had that great video? The president is a foreign country. I mean, the UK is kind of going through that. Granville Thorndike, yeah. That is a very chilling video to watch. I mean, it's about the UK, but I mean, it's a very similar story in the United States. Is that after World War II, that generation basically was just so beat up that they kind of were willing to kind of go with the flow and not object to things, and they were bought off basically by consumerism. and their kids especially kind of bought into this kind of American exceptionalism. In the UK, I'm sure it's a slightly different concept, but they let in all these people because they thought the good times are never going to end, and it's resulted in this shit where, I went to my my hometown, and all the people there were like Indian. I mean, like it was just really, really unsettling, and that has to click at some point in people's brains. I know there's all the brainwashing. I know there's all this sort of social pressure to not to feel that way, but when you're literally being replaced and when you can't even afford to live in your hometown, come on, people.
I went through that coming of age in Seattle, so I'm 40 years old, and I remember, when I was like 17, 18, I'd been on my own since I was 15, and you could get yourself, if you had a pickup truck and a set of hand tools, you could get a job working construction, building houses for $18 an hour right off the street. And by the time I was 21, just 3 years later, there had been such an influx of Mexican immigrants that those same jobs were now $10 an hour for a white man, $8 an hour for a Mexican.
Yep. Yeah, I remember being in high school and walking by all the construction sites during the summer, and I'm like, I would probably enjoy that, as a learning experience or something, but how the fuck am I going to compete with all these Mexicans? I mean, they're everywhere. They're absolutely everywhere. And then you go to Home Depot, and there's more of them coming still. I experienced that, and it did not click with me until I was older because I never really felt that pressure because I was going to college. But it was like the reality is that the system is it's run by very greedy people, and I guess that's never been any different. But I think the difference between Europe and America is that America is a very diverse, disunited place, and I think people really just don't have the power to influence this massive system that is very distant in many ways. Whereas in Europe, smaller places, countries, more traditions, they can kind of organize much more effectively. We're really bad at that. We talked to the former British Nationalist Party leader Nick Griffin about that, and he said, the same thing. I mean, the ability of political organization in America is really abysmal compared to what he's seen where he's from.
Well, and it all comes down to power, and it all comes down to the average person, the average voter not having any power. The man is going to do what the man is going to do.
Yeah, and I'd even say the vote is not even that useful. I mean, when you're dealing with 300 million plus people. I mean, you experienced this in your union, I'm sure. It's like, have you ever met, I don't know who the leader is of the union. I guess it's Jimmy Hoffa Jr., but it's like there's no way you're going to get a message to him. So I think the fact that we're living in such a big society makes it all the more difficult for the small man to have a voice.
I hate to say it, but I think at this point, we ought to just go ahead and just welcome the Mexicans with open arms, because I'll tell you, and look, you give me the choice between 22 million Mexicans living in America and 22 million Pakistanis. Yeah, what do you think I'm gonna,
Yeah.
Hey, the Mexicans aren't so bad, right?
Yeah.
What scares me is the African subcontinent, the African continent, right, and what's going to happen in 10 years or 20 years from now when you're going to see mass starvation and you're going to see the UN putting pressure on us to start taking in Africans.
Well, they're doing a number on Europe right now. I mean, the sort of entry points are gradually being sort of closed off as the locals are like, what the fuck is this? We don't have a job and we got to pull these people's weight, and Spain is now the sort of entry point. But yeah, who knows where it's going to go next.
There's an article in The Economist just the other day that basically said why Europe should welcome Eurafrica.
Oh, I saw that. Yeah, with the jigsaw pieces. Yeah, that fucking magazine. Okay, and I was part of that stupid class of like, oh yeah, I'm going to be a master of the universe or whatever. I would read that shit. Okay, and it was like very exciting because it would tell you about all these big companies and big trends and things like that. But they had they ran another article. That one is particularly jarring and very obvious once you understand who owns that stupid paper. It's a Rothschild operation. But
also the Agnelli family, the people.
Yeah, they're kind of intertwined. 40%. I mean, once Johnny Agnelli died, I mean his legacy was sort of in trouble, and so they had I want to do a show about him at one point, but his daughter's sons, like his daughter married a Jewish guy named John Elkann, and I think that might be part of it. But anyway, that's true. It's owned by them as well. But they had another article on Brazil's supposedly right-wing, quote-unquote, leader who recently was stabbed, I believe. And they're saying how... What's that?
Bolsonaro was the guy's name.
Yeah, they were running an anti-him cover because, populism is so terrible, right? And you start to see the pattern of that type of publication. I mean, you see it in Forbes, you see it in any sort of aspirational class magazine about money and investing or whatever bullshit. That stuff is very dangerous because it gives people the false impression that if they just like sit at their desk and trade stocks all day, they're going to get rich. I'm going to be a Forex trader. That's like a joke Sam Hyde makes, but. It really is a stupid country that we can't get it through our heads that look, there's no free lunch. Okay, you gotta have some reasonableness in sort of your goals, and at the same time, I don't blame the individuals because I think the system is sort of set up that way to kind of make people very vulnerable to programming, and so I think it's by design, definitely, but. The programmers are definitely not going to change, and so I don't see any other way other than getting the word out that they're not doing you any favors by giving you these messages. It's like telling the black kid that he's going to be in the NBA when he grows up. I mean, you have as much chance of that as you do becoming the next Elon Musk. I mean, it's that hard. You just have to break it down by the numbers, and so I think the education system needs to be reformed.
Even the SoundCloud rap game is rough out there, man.
Oh yeah, buy my SoundCloud mixtape. I mean, I don't even know what you do now. It's like you can't make money doing that. It's crazy. So
I want to ask our guest what exactly he thinks about government service unions. I
wanted to ask him that too.
AFGE, the American Federation of Government Employees. Recently, they were recorded at a rally chanting "Lock him up" in response to Trump's proposed federal service labor reform. Do you see them as members of the working class?
Some of them. Sure. My mother works for the federal government, and she's a member of the union. And I remember I asked her. I said, "Well, what union are you in?" She said, "Well, gee, I don't know." I said, "Have you ever seen a business agent come and visit you?" "Well, no." Have you ever filed a grievance? Well, yeah. Did you ever hear back? Well, no. So, they're no different than any of the other unions. However many people that had out there chanting, they were probably paid union officers.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean they're toothless. They're worthless. They're not. I mean, as far as doing the job of a union and sticking up for their workers, they do nothing. They're going out there. They're yelling and gnashing their teeth against President Trump for, whatever reason.
Well, there are a lot of women probably. I mean, the pictures I've seen.
Supreme Court. I know the Supreme Court just passed on that judgment that public employees who are union members do not have to be part of the union, and so the lawsuits now are getting filed. For people like here in Oregon, people are filing lawsuits against the government, whatever government it might be, to get their union dues back. Because even though they were not members of the union, they still were forced to pay dues.
There was
that's all I really know about that.
Well, there was the very famous case in 1981 where Reagan fired all the air traffic controllers, and I'm interested in hearing your take on it because I see it in two ways. Okay, so they were striking, and obviously it's a very stressful job. So look, I mean, if they have some grievance that's legit, okay, there maybe should be some concessions there. But they were asking for let me get the exact numbers here. They wanted a up to 40% pay raise, early retirements, reduction of the work week from 32 hours from 40 hours, a $10,000 bonus. That's a pretty hefty demand in 1981, and I think the government came back and offered them a percentage of that. It wasn't all of it, but they were like, okay, will you take this? And they all struck. And that's illegal under federal law for, I would argue, fairly reasonable reasons, because you don't want planes crashing. And they ended up having to use the military to kind of backstop the lack of air traffic controllers. And so Reagan said, look, you're fired. All right. You guys don't take your job, seriously enough to protect the public safety, so you're gone. And I think that was a reasonable thing to do. But again, I'm not anti being reasonable, but that seemed to be very unreasonable to me. So from the union's point of view. So what do you think about that, Mike?
I would have to ask what their wages were in the first place.
No, sure. I mean, if they're making $1 an hour, okay, but yeah, okay, that's fair. But assuming it's, well, why would you take the job if it was that low? I'm assuming it's average, right? So that's a pretty big
I think in cases like that, I think it should go to arbitration. You start with a mediator and then you go to arbitration. I think, I don't think the president should just walked in and fired everybody. Mm-hmm. I think that both sides should have found an arbitrator that they can both agree on and leave the final say in his hands.
Yeah. Okay. That's an interesting idea. That's all I know about the public unions. If you look at the Wikipedia description of this, they sort of blame Reagan for the decline of unions. I don't think it's that simple. I think basically the economy changed and manufacturing dropped.
Decline. They were on the decline since the 70s.
Of course.
Yeah. Well, I would blame corporatism also,
Well, yeah. I mean, it's kind of a broad term, but
there were a lot of mergers, and then a lot of offshore.
That's right. Yeah, if you guys remember, I mean, the Gordon Gekko character from Wall Street was based on a lot of the very famous figures in the 80s who were doing a lot of these leveraged buyouts. And the sort of operating model of that was you would borrow from the banks to buy up a company, and in order to pay off your debt, you would effectively slash costs as much as you could to the bone. And Mitt Romney was doing this too with some of his operations, and they call it private equity now. It's a much more euphemistic term, as opposed to Bain, and they used to call it vulture capital and shit. But it's there's another term I'm missing, but it was a green mailing and all that stuff, and they had these hostile takeovers that they just take these companies over from management, fire them all, cut the cost to the bone, fire employees, sell off assets, and then they'd pay off the debt, and then they'd flip it, and they'd make the multiples on their actual invested capital, because they were borrowing most of it, was insane. It was just 10, 20, 30, 100 times as much as they put in. So the returns were there, but the legacy of that was that they just slash and burn a lot of these companies.
Well, yeah, and it just goes back to what I was saying before about what cost does that have on society?
It's not good.
No,
it's not good.
The way corporations are set up, I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is that when you have a publicly traded company that has stockholders, if you do anything at all that will minimize returns to your shareholders, that's illegal.
Yeah, that's right.
If there's a way that you can possibly fuck over the workers and make more money for the shareholders, well, you have to do it.
Yeah, and that was the whole thing that Milton Friedman was kind of famous for saying. It's like the management at companies have no responsibility other than to the shareholders. And I always thought that was, even in my libertarian days, I had a kind of hard time wrapping my head around that, because it's kind of arbitrary. It's well, why them only? I mean, I can understand if you're a guy who, wants to invest, that's a good sort of social thing, to not blow your money, to think about the future. You want people to save their food for the winter. That's a good thing to have savings, to have investment. But workers are important too. The customer is important too. I mean, all of that's important. I don't get this obsession.
It all just speaks to the disconnect between the different classes.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And I don't know how we bridge that, but I guess if everybody ends up poor eventually, maybe that'll fix itself.
Yeah, we'll all be together. Don't worry.
There's a very good paper on, kind of a good introductory paper that cites a lot of various books and papers that have been written for the last 40 years on the topic, called Managerialism and Ideology and Its Evolution. It's written by Christine Dorn, and I'll include a link in the description. It's free for everyone to go read. It's about like 17 pages long. But it makes an interesting point that around the late 1970s, early 80s, the managerial system had really started to break down. You started to see labor really starting to recognize that management as a class hierarchy within companies had become kind of a problem, that they were very anti-labor. By the 90s, you start to see the rise of what's called CSR. If you go to business school, you see this a lot. You might even have several classes in it, corporate social responsibility. This is the basis of stakeholder theory. Stakeholder theory is a means of placating people so that they don't recognize that you are still engaged in stockholder theory. You're engaged in Gaussian theory of the firm, and you're engaged in sole fiduciary responsibility. But you are placating them with corporate social causes, corporate ideology. This is why you have Nike running ads with Colin Kaepernick, whatever his name is.
Well, yeah, it's nothing substantial. They'll give some money to charity, or they'll make some grand gesture. But as far as actually, look at the slave labor that's making those Nike shoes over in Asia.
Right. And there's been several articles, I think in Breitbart, talking about how Nike has closed several American factories in the last 2 years. So
I didn't know we had any.
What's the calculus here? So Nike is going to close American factories, reduce the power of American workers, but they're going to placate you and placate many of those same workers they probably just destroyed with this corporate social responsibility shtick.
I mean, I know Nike's a Beaverton, Oregon operation, but it's like, people in Oregon realize how nasty this company is? I mean, I don't know. I'm asking.
No, I think my experiences in Oregon, my experiences at UO, are that people, and this is just my experience, are infatuated with Phil Knight, are infatuated with Nike, and I think that
it's like everybody thinks they're going to be like Phil Knight when they grow up. I mean, what the fuck is wrong with people?
They will. I think a lot of them will refuse, like Yuri Bezmenov used to say, they will refuse to see the truth even if you show them facts and documents proving it. They will refuse to believe it until the very end. They will refuse to believe that Phil Knight hates the American worker, hates having to have started his company here, and wants nothing to do with the United States anymore.
Yeah, but Black Lives Matter, okay?
Yeah.
Oh my God, I don't know what's going on in Oregon these days. Just to kind of slightly go off topic, but since you're Oregon based, are people insane there, or they're?
I was in the courthouse. I was in the courthouse the other day conducting some business, and I was sitting on a bench next to some police officers, and they were testifying in a case, and I was sitting there for hours and listening to these cops just sort of talk and bullshit and shoot the breeze and whatnot, and while this is all going on, right next door, Antifa had stormed City Hall. Antifa ran in with bullhorns. I guess they gaffled the guard at the front of the City Hall, hit him on the head with a bullhorn, knocked him out, and then did a sit-in. Yeah, I mean these Antifa fucks are out of control. I live in Southeast Portland, and there's graffiti spray painted on walls just feet from my house that punch Nazis. Punch Nazis, resist. You'll see these flyers. One of my favorites was a flyer that was like a cartoon of our dear great President Trump getting his head split in half with a chainsaw, and then it directed people to go to the Service Employees Union down the street to receive urban combat training, and the urban combat training would be taught by strategic gamers. So they have these video game nerds. Yes, video game nerds, strategic gaming nerds teaching Antifa how to conduct street combat. It's so fucking crazy you wouldn't even believe it.
Oh, what is it? What is the combat going to be? Stabbing you with a hypodermic needle? I'm really wondering.
Swinging a mouse controller at you.
Yeah, I mean, I assume they were probably going to tell them about how to stand in different formations, or flank to the left, or just completely idiotic.
Well, I
bullshit.
saw a picture of these guys. I'll try to put it in YouTube if I can find it. But basically, they had like military style gear on, and they had these like riot shields and helmets on. I'm like, well, who's paying for that? I mean, Jesus Christ! If you look at the alt-right rallies, I mean, everybody, you could tell like the guy made it in his basement, or his garage the night before. I mean, these guys are getting funding. I mean, I don't know how stupid people have to be
I
not
don't
to
know
see
for a
this.
fact that they are getting funding or not. I can tell you off the record and on the record that I have come in contact and talked to a few different people who are active Antifa members.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And they're basically what you would expect them to be. They're low-wage earning young people who are completely deluded by what they see on the television and read online. They are out of touch with reality. They really truly believe that they're fighting, that if they don't get out there and fight, that there's going to be Nazis, just skinning black people alive in the streets if they don't go out there and go for us.
I believe some of them are like that.
Believe it.
But I also think some of those guys are trying to get laid, especially the men. And then also I think it's just kind of fun. I mean, just to run around like that.
I can't take credit for this quote, but there's a great James LaFond book called The Mind of Mescaline Franklin. And James LaFond says that Antifa guys are out there because they want to impress the Antifa chicks, right?
Yeah.
Antifa chicks are out there because they just really want to be properly disrespected by a real man.
I think that's, well.
I think there's some truth in that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it's, well, Trump was talking about that at one of his rallies about how unmanly these guys are. It's just,
hey, listen, dude, I go to bars, and I live in a fucking hipster neighborhood. Okay, I go to the bars, and I quietly sip my beer. Maybe I'll take my chick out there, and we'll have a cheeseburger or whatever. And I'll listen to these young people talk. And these young people, they're not talking about getting laid or going to the punk rock concert. They're all talking about social justice. They're all talking about racism. They're talking about cultural appropriation. They're talking about toxic masculinity. I was telling you earlier that I was listening to a conversation between some young guy trying to pick up on a hot chick and telling her how she needs to stop wearing makeup and sexy clothes because that just feeds the patriarchy. And listen, dude, it's not just one time. It's like every fucking time I go out, I hear these people, and it's just like the same thing. Like they're so wound up, and I think it's kind of a Portland thing. I think it's a lot of young people come here from Omaha, Nebraska. They want to come out to Portland and live the dream. But these fucking kids are insane. They're scary. They really are scary. If they ever, I tried to have a conversation with a guy one time who was real into the Occupy Wall Street thing, and I just asked him. I said, like, what was it that you were hoping to accomplish by taking over the city park where I like to take my kids and camping there for a month? That has nothing to do with Wall Street. Like, what is it? And this guy got so fucking mad. He was a bartender. He jumped over the bar and was getting ready to fight me. Okay, the two women had to hold him back while I laughed.
I mean, there's just something so feminine about the whole culture that I think...
it's all an emotional reaction. It's all driven by emotion.
Yeah.
Like, I know you guys read Jim Go, and I'm sure. And it's facts and feelings. It's become a cliche nowadays.
If you want to know what it's going to be like when these people take over, if they do, we talked about this in our Heilbroner episode. Like the woke college youth showing up in rural Ukraine and executing farmers for not participating in the local commune. That's what it's going to be. Like, that's what these people really dream about doing. If you ever interact with a lot of these, I don't know, irony left Twitter guys, that's basically their ideal world is executing farm kids that used to shoulder check them in high school. That's really what it's all about.
Well, did you read the Steve Saylor piece about the parallels between the Cultural Revolution in China and what's going on in America now? Where you have all these young college age just want to destroy the New Order and, tear down statues. Like the similarities are numerous.
I agree, and I think the difference is they're sort of being led by groups that I don't think they realize are leading them. I mean, I think and you correct me here, but I just get the impression, I was, you can obviously cite people like Soros or something like that, but I think it's more complicated than that. I think the sort of deep state, New World Order types who do view the entire planet as theirs, they like people like this, and they'll sort of, they'll steer the cops away from them. That's certainly happened in my experience. And they'll sort of give them air support without actually making it too obvious, in that they're sort of the Revolutionary Guard to attack the enemies of the deep state. And whether they're receiving direct funding or indirect funding, they're receiving help. But I don't think they realize it. Whereas in China, I mean, it was clear. Mao is in charge. But now it's much more shadowy.
Yeah, well, you're right, Adam. The main difference is that in the cases of China and Russia, you had a new class that had just come to power, a new revolutionary class, and they were the foot soldiers of this class. Whereas now you have an entrenched oligarchy that has been here for well over 100 years, and they're serving those interests. And so they will only be permitted to operate within the bounds that they're needed to operate in. If they were ever to, go rogue and start attacking targets that were not endorsed by the system, then they would be shut down.
I mean, I hate to say it, but it's all college kids. It's all people who have attended college at one time or another.
Right.
There was an article yesterday that talked about the incoming freshmen at Rutgers University being handed, the orientation packet that they had to identify what level of privilege they had, whether they're privileged or unprivileged. And the questionnaire was, are you a person of color? Did you have both parents in your house? So, it's a chance for these kids to put a label on themselves and decide whether or not they are, and of course, everybody wants to be oppressed. Everybody wants to be a victim.
Yeah, once you start realizing that's the sort of value set of our deranged society today, you have a choice as a man, especially, to go with it, or to realize that is actually unbelievably feminine and antithetical to your own sort of status as a man in the long run. Because there's no woman who respects a victim. I mean, no way. You cannot get ahead in life with men, let alone women, with that attitude. It's a very feminine response, and I think that's encouraged for the men today because that's the sort of opposition class to the powers that be. I mean, I think that's part of what happened with feminism. It was just it sort of demasculated the country and made people very compliant workers. I mean, women are very obedient. They'll do kind of what the culture demands of them. And so if men behave that way, you've got a whole slave class now.
Deindustrialization will have that effect. I mean, you don't have any more labor. I mean, labor organizations are.
It's not just deindustrialization. It's just a cultural sort of value shift. I mean, it's contributed to by that perhaps, but I think women in the workplace, with the fact that they can do jobs in the office as opposed to pulling a chain down a factory line or something like that. Sure, it's intertwined, but I think the broader thing is that the slave mentality comes with this kind of weak-willed person who looks to kind of be the victim as opposed to being kind of.
Well, it's almost as if you talk of it's the aspirational classes, and it's almost like they aspire to weakness.
Yeah. It's truly gross. I mean, how unesthetic, the country's become. I mean, like I was watching some clips of like the movies from the 80s. I mean, Nick's example of Snake Plissken from Escape from New York or something. I mean, we don't have movies
Jack Burton
like that
from
anymore.
Big Trouble.
Oh, okay. So Nick's the movie guy here.
Doc was pressed.
Yeah, exactly, man.
But my point was like just the action hero has been replaced with the action zero and the sort of almost like Woody Allen type, and then you've got like the chick kicking butt. I mean, it's truly a role reversal.
Or the hero is sitting in front of a computer screen, furiously hacking the.
Yeah. I know.
I hate to say it, but I'm a little bit older than you guys, I think, And I think it's sort of important not to dehumanize these young people who are delusional and deranged.
Well, they are victims in a way. I mean,
in a way, yeah, they don't know any different. They haven't had the opportunity to have real life experiences. They've never had their ass kicked. They've never, been fired from a job or, whatever it is. They're not inherently bad people. They're just conformists.
Yeah.
And they're the same people who 100 years ago, when that movie A Birth of a Nation came out, you remember the height of Klan membership in America was, 1 million people. Right after that movie, The Birth of a Nation came out, everybody saw that movie and rushed out to join the Klan or start their own charter of the Klan. And it speaks volumes to how much people are influenced by the media and by images on a screen.
You're absolutely right.
These people, the one thing they all have in common is that they consume too much media.
Yeah, I do wonder how much of that plays into it. I mean, that's sort of what I was getting into earlier. Was you rarely see the image of the American, manufacturing man or truck driver as a hero in film anymore, or hero on TV shows anymore, or even just
as a character. I don't watch television. I don't have a television. But, I'm in a hotel room. All the people on the TV and the movies, they all have these nice houses that are very clean, and they're all wearing brand new clothes. You don't ever see, like, a guy just living in a shitty apartment. Or I guess if you do, it's a comedy, And the fact that he's living in that shitty apartment is the joke.
There was like an indie movie recently called Upgrade. Actually, I watched it on a plane. And the lead character is essentially a car mechanic, and he works on old cars, and it takes place 15 years from now in Los Angeles. That was the first time I'd seen like a lead white normal male, who's very obviously straight, in a working class profession as the main character. I have not seen that in a long time.
For any young people out there listening right now, I would highly encourage you, if you are in a dead-end service industry job, counter jockeying at the gas station or working a cash register somewhere, go down to a local union hall and find out about an apprenticeship program. You go to the plumbers union, you go to the electricians union, you can get into an apprenticeship program. You can be making good apprentice wages, $20+ an hour while you go to a little bit of school, learn about the pipes and the wires. And when you get out, a plumber or an electrician, I think they make somewhere around $50 an hour when you're in the union, and it's almost like a free education. A lot of young people don't know about that stuff. They don't realize the options that are out there for them. They'll look and they'll see who's hiring on Craigslist or whatever kind of low skill, no experience necessary jobs are out there.
Yeah.
But there is an opportunity to get in the trades. And right now, with the economy booming the way it is and the aging workforce retiring at the rate that they are, it's a good time for a young guy to get in there and learn a trade.
Yeah, and if your mom or dad gives you shit about it, like, why do we pay for your college? Just tell them, when you were doing the type of work that I'm trying to do now, nobody was going to college. And so it's just a role reversal of supply and demand. There is an oversupply of college-educated people with degrees that are practically useless. And the skill gap is very stark today as opposed to your parents' generation.
If you're a manager, you're in the managerial class, your job is easily eliminated. Easily. But there's a shortage of diesel mechanics out there.
Oh, yeah.
When you're actually contributing something to the economy,
that's right,
you're not expendable.
Yeah. So let's talk about the infamous Jimmy Hoffa, the senior one.
Jimmy Hoffa Sr. was a crook. I don't think he started out as a crook, and I don't think that he was a bad-hearted crook, but I think that he was scared of the Chicago Mafia, and he was scared that they were going to kill him if he didn't do what they wanted. And that is why he allowed them to raid the Central States Pension Fund the way they did. You look at a guy like Alan Glick. Okay, Alan Glick walked into the Central States Pension Fund and said, "I'd like to get a $62 million loan." They said, "Sure, here you go. Here's a check." They didn't even run his credit first. They just gave him the check. He was a front man for the Chicago mob.
So where'd the money go? I mean, I know they were involved in some casinos at some point, but was this?
Yeah, I mean that particular loan right there was, I think that was he was the front man for the La Hacienda Casino. This was in like 74, whatever it was. I'm not real clear on the dates, but all this money that they loaned out to people never got paid back, and you got these poor old broken down limp dick truck drivers that are getting their pension checks cut and cut and cut. And it's all due to the corruption of Jimmy Hoffa. A lot of people in the Teamsters Union look kind of, when you talk about the mafia, they'll kind of smile and give you a sly wink, like, yeah, almost as if they're proud of the mafia involvement within their union, as if somehow that gives them an association with the mafia too.
Mm-hmm.
And no, the mafia was just stealing your money the whole time.
Right.
The mafia doesn't have your back. If you go on strike, the mafia is not going to go bomb the fucking employer. The mafia is there to steal your pension fund and nothing more. And then you look at poor little Jimmy Hoffa Jr. He's no better. He's a crook himself. Now, when he was a lawyer for quite a while, and he still was paying union dues to the local 299. For years and years and years, when he didn't have to. He wasn't a car hauler. He wasn't driving a truck. I think he might have done it for like one summer while he was in law school. But the whole reason why he was paying union dues for all those years is because he knew someday he was going to take over he was going to run for office, take over the 299, and then from there, make himself president based on his father's name.
Oh, certainly. There was a guy you're familiar with, Tom Leadham, I believe, who ran against him in kind of like the 2006 times for elections.
Now, Tom Leadham is a good example of what a union leader should be. I know Tom Leadham personally. He's a guy, him and Stan White were a couple of forklift operators down at Unified Food Warehouse in Clackamas. And they got sick and tired of the corruption that they saw going on with their local union, taking these bullshit contracts. And they realized the only thing they could do is run for office, and they did. The local 206 used to be like the most corrupt Teamster local in the state. And these guys took it over. They reformed it. They did it with the help of TDU, the Teamsters for a Democratic Union, which is run by Ken Paff, who is another guy that he's got to be 70 now. He just works tirelessly to reform the Teamsters Union. And, these guys would get good contracts. They would get good land. They would fight. I mean, I know he was telling me tricks of what they would do during contract negotiations, which I won't say on the air because the tricks against the company to get but they would fight for their members and they would get what they wanted. They would get good contracts. They would get good pension. They would get good health care. And these guys, and they were good, hardworking, honest, upright guys. Before, like Ron Carey, who was the president of the Teamsters, he got banned for life for corruption, but then ultimately found not guilty. I don't think he actually was corrupt. But before Ron Carey came along, it would be that you would have to have a 3/4 majority vote against the contract, or else it would get ratified. So if you have 65% of the members vote against the contract, it would still be ratified. And they had to go file lawsuits to get that changed to make the Teamsters Union more democratic. Under Ron Carey is another example of what a union leader should be like. Ron Carey would show up at the businesses where he was the business agent every morning, 6 o'clock. He'd have his little pad of paper. He'd say, "Hey, anybody have any problems? Anybody have any grievances?" Okay, every day like clockwork, he would go to all of the businesses that his local represented, and that's unheard of. Most people will never even meet their business agent. When I was campaigning for the little election out here in Oregon, I went to a place that was a food processor. They make little cut fruit bowls, pineapples and watermelons and all that stuff. And everybody working there was from Mexico. They were illegals. And I brought a buddy with me who spoke Spanish. And these people were telling us that they were paying $60 a week union dues and making minimum wage. Now, the Teamsters Constitution states that union wages should not be over 2.5 times the hourly wage per month.
Mm.
So these guys should have been paying $20 a month. But the corrupt local 305, because they were illegals who didn't know any better, who were just happy to have a job, had these guys paying $60 a week. Now, who knows where that money went?
Yeah. I mean, this is probably a naive question, but I mean, I'm already sort of telling myself it's not probably a good idea. But what if you made another union? I mean, I don't know if it's beyond repair at this point. It's obviously that the problem is you won't have enough numbers to compete with the Teamsters because, like, you only can effectively call a strike if you have everybody on board. So I don't know how you would do that, but it seems like there's a lot of endemic corruption in the union. And Tom Leadham didn't win, even though he had a lot of support from union members, and it just didn't seem to happen. And
Hoffa won on his last name.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, that just goes to the ignorance of the average person, I guess, that they can't put that together. I mean, for fuck's sake, we got George Bush II because of that.
Sure. Or,
that was.
You got Schwarzenegger was the governor of California, based on what?
He was in some good movies, but yeah, I got you.
It's all name recognition.
Yeah. Well, we got.
Yeah, but we would go out and we would campaign. And we went to the ports where they bring in the new cars to get service before they go to the dealership. We would go to these food processors, to the taxi cabs, to all these different places, and we'd talk to these people and say, what's your problem with the union? And they would say, hey, we have no health care. We have no pension fund. We're working, our wage is, $11 an hour. And why are we even paying union dues? You ask these people, who's your business agent? They'd say, we don't know. We've never seen them before. So the unions are corrupt, but more than anything, they're lazy. They just take the path of least resistance.
Yeah. And would it be not viable just to create a different group, like for maybe on like a company level? It's like, look, Teamsters, you guys suck. All right, all of us are going to do our own negotiating now. Why couldn't you do that? Would they just fire you? Would that be their response?
No, I think the way the laws are written is that you would first have to decertify the union and then wait a year.
Oh, jeez.
But I don't know about like starting your own union. I don't know what that would entail. I know that here in Portland we have like a little fast food place called Burgerville, and they all decided to unionize. Yeah. And the union that they chose to represent them was the IWW, the International Workers of the World, the Wobblies, of all people. So yeah, I mean, I think that you would just have to find a charter from another international. I don't really know how you can start your own union. I know that it's been done. I know that the hobos and the freight train riders back in the early days of the 1930s, it used to be that you would get hauled in and thrown in jail for vagrancy if you did not have a union card or $20 in your pocket. So these guys started their own labor union called the Tourists Local Number 63 or whatever. So they had the Tourists Union just so they could have a union card in their back pocket to keep from going to jail.
So they could ride in the boxcar for free.
Yeah, well, it's a tourist union. Well, because back then they would enforce vagrancy laws. If you're walking around town late at night, if you don't have $20 in your pocket, I think they call those blue laws.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, what's the future? I mean, is there any hope here? I mean, obviously there's certain good unions out there. It seems like the trade unions seem to be the best. You've got frustrations in your union, which we wish you luck. Sounds like there's some good leaders out there, but there's a lot of corruption you guys are up against.
Yeah, I don't have a good feeling about the future. The union is only as strong as its membership. Mm-hmm. If the membership isn't involved and doesn't go to meetings, it doesn't pay attention to the contracts, it doesn't pay attention to what their leadership is doing, then everything's going to keep going downhill the way it has been the last 50 years.
Well, if I can bring us to a close, I think the quote is, the price of freedom is vigilance.
Choice is yours.